Councilmember. Alderman Marchand, Ward 25.
So we have 3 items before us. We're going to take them in order of here. So first will be ORS 2022. Before we begin, I just want to announce to the public, I told my colleagues this, but my intention tonight is to open this public hearing. So if there are members of the public who wish to testify after the presentation, they are welcome to do so.
Which ones did you take? Yeah, all of them are good.
Yeah.
Yeah, the back one.
But I see that will presenter, so you may come forward once at the table. Mr. Lucas has the microphones. And anybody who's going to participate and speak should remember to give their name and address for the record before you get started.
Hi, I'm Carlos Fury. I'm the Development Administration, as well as 244 Kennedy Avenue. Just here to introduce my colleagues. Just the first time, two of them, first time appearing from you person. Laura Brown, who's our relatively new city plan director. You guys probably know, and first time to testify, and it's for BJ Valley from their office. Just wanted to give you a little bit of background. I think you guys all know this, but welcome to Friends New England.
Kathy Gray is Economic Development Department, Deputy Director of Economic Development, 257 Road, New Haven.
Eugene Farley, quality analyst in the Mayor's office, address 65 Oak Street, New Haven, 065. Laura Brown, detail. So I have.
It's for the public.
Okay, so I provided you all with copies of our slide deck. We're going to discuss the funding for recreational cannabis market here in Cleveland. Last year, the state passed some legislation that would allow for this, and substitutes how we decided that they don't for that. We put forward our proposal for what we turn to slide 1. Just to give some context of where the state is in the process. At this point, you'll see a list of licenses. These are licenses that are available by state. One, 2, and another is 9. You'll see the start date when these applications open. They are each open for 90 days. And you'll see that as of the state today, all of them are open. And you'll spend some time today, May, the middle of the summer, their applications were made open. So just to give you a little bit more context, the licenses, when someone applies in this initial modeling grant, it doesn't give them license to operate, it gives them license to move forward in the process. So part of that process will include applying for zoning here in New Haven specifically, and that will happen in the next 3 months. It's just the application period to have the opportunity to get further later. Also later in the year, we have another round that I'm announced later in 2022. So this is just for getting started. On the next slide, with regard to the lottery that I just mentioned, this is how many licenses of each of the 9 types will be awarded statewide. So in total, across all municipalities that zone, this is what's going to be given out this year, in this first round. If you have any questions about any specific license type, we can talk about that. So just to give you a little bit of background on how we kind of went through this process of figuring out what the best way to go about something even is, we reviewed first of all the statute that was passed last year. It's 300 pages, if anybody's interested in looking at it. But we reviewed that, we had some meetings with the state, including the licensing agency, which is the Department of Consumer Protection, and we also spoke with the Social Equity Council, which is in charge of kind of regulating the social equity piece of all this, which is not only opening up the market, but making it possible for communities that are most impacted by the war drugs to also have an opportunity to participate in that market. And so in addition to that, we've spoken to business owners, interested business owners, folks in communities who are interested in this, kept a log of their interests, licenses they wanted. And we also have discussions with industry professionals both here in Massachusetts, other places, folks to call and have conversations with their experiences in the market, what that looks like. We've also done site visits to both retailers and cultivators. And we also did some thorough research on zoning approaches that folks in neighboring states such as Massachusetts have done, and also here in Connecticut, as this is rolled out over the last year, less than a year. On the next slide, you'll see some evidence on our site visits. This first set of 6 photos is from retail stores. And just have an idea of what they look like, how these are displayed, what the front facade looks like, the security that is at the door, things like that. And on the next slide, you'll have some photos of what the cultivation process looks like, what the inside of these cultivation facilities look like in terms of growing cannabis. And we can answer questions about that later as well. And finally, I will turn it over to Laura to go over the specific zone.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So I'm very thankful that my colleagues here and my colleague Bill Long, who goes on, he's our deputy director of zoning, did a lot of this background research, the way the groundwork for this ordinance. And what you see before you here is a proposal for our zoning ordinance. And as you can see, what the committee that discussed this in great detail after the research that we described was to allow these establishments to locate in business and industrial districts only, and to not allow residential, not allow to locate residential districts, the light growing zones, park districts, cemetery, and airport zoning districts. They are also meeting the distance requirements as required by state law from the boundary of all school buildings, according to within our ordinance. And we have also removed planning districts, including River Street, MDP, Hilton Downtown, and Walmart, MDP. So as you can see here, this chart outlines the various types of licenses that are provided by the state, and the special considerations for these license types in terms of what would be permitted or not. So as you can see, only delivery service and transporter licenses are as of right in those allowed zones, but others would only be allowed to operate with special permit. Next slide. So again, just an overview. The ordinance aligns with the state law, in particular, the 500-foot advertising buffer from schools, which is a big part of the map provision moment that applies to the ordinance. New Haven's requirements are the 500-foot buffer, but also the 1,500-foot distance requirement from other establishments. And we already talked about some of the other prohibitions, some of those municipal development plan areas, residential districts, park cemetery districts, And also prohibitions on temporary cannabis events, including street vending. Again, permitted locations are by special permit only, and that would require a public hearing of the city plan commission and also consideration of sensitive receptors, which I will show you a little bit more about in the slide. Sensitive receptors would be those things that are considered for the application of a special permit for these establishments. And that would be things like proximity to parks, playgrounds, or community gardens. Other things to be considered would be location, size, and intensity of the proposed establishment, odor control, security, noise, etc. In addition to those things that are normally considered for any regular special permit by the city. So the next slide gives you a graphic showing that 500-foot buffer. We do want to mention that the original map that was put forth to the Board of Alders was created using a GIS layer in which the school layer was marked by the point that is the centroid of the school. So in that case, the allowable use buffer around the school was much smaller than if it was the boundary of the school building. And when we discovered that's how that layer was made, we modified the map to adjust it to align with the state statute. So as you can see, this just shows you how that changed the map. So it significantly reduced the area of allowable use in the city after that map was redone. So what you see in the next slide is the current proposed map to be adopted with the zoning ordinance. So the purple locations in dark purple on this map are those allowed locations. So again, many of those for most of the licenses are allowable by special permit only. But these are the locations where it would be allowed. Your next map, and I apologize, it's very small, shows in, those areas in purple are now in pink purple stripe. But you can see we've overlaid this with the zoning map, the zone areas, and also the neighborhood boundaries. And I want to let you know on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the discussion that we had at the Plan Commission and the public hearing that was held as a result of that discussion. The result was that the public and those commissioners felt strongly that there should be a map that designated the neighborhood boundaries. So that's why we are putting this forward to you today. I also wanted to let you know that there will be a map that will be presented to the public as an online widget. They'll be able to look up a location, find the related zone, and see if that parcel is in an allowable location. So no one will have to use a map this small to determine if a parcel is allowable or not. So the next page shows the results of the City Plan Commission hearing and some of the recommendations that came that are being put forward to you today. Several of them are text edits in the ordinance, so that's the removal of the BC zone that has been appropriately listed as prohibited. That's also the adoption of the map that you have before you. They also recommended that street names and neighborhood boundaries be incorporated and included on the map. And that the Board of Alders conduct research by having other municipalities provide their experiences prior to adopting any additional ordinances related to this, and further consideration of time limits on special permits, as well as a robust public education and engagement process. So that's what we have for you. We also have Kathy here to answer business specific questions, but I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you all for that clarification. I'm going to ask all of us first. Are there any members of the community who have any questions or answers? Sorry.
Chair. Thank the city staff for the presentation. Regret that I was not able to attend the city planning commission meeting. So I'm eager to read the report, which I have never seen, although some of the summarized in the presentation. I have a few questions. Some of it I think I know the answer, but I'm not sure. Some of it I really know. The first one is the rationale on special permit for most of the cannabis related activity or establishments, but has a right for delivery and transport.
Sure, I'll speak to that and then I'll ask you to talk a little bit about how those businesses differ from the other types of businesses. First of all, we are the first city in the state that's implementing this. So, you know, creating a special permit process allows the city to add some sensitive receptors or things to be considered on a special permit, which may be different in different areas of the city. So that's one reason to implement this special permit process. I think your question is more about why it's different for certain types of businesses.
Those two.
Right. So you could speak to how the actual structure of those two types of businesses, the transporter and delivery businesses, different from those.
Absolutely. So, but in my license, essentially, transport and delivery are the only licenses out of the 9 that you wouldn't have product housed on site for extended periods of time. They go from point A to point B. The delivery service specifically is from products that the producer, cultivator, the delivery service is from the retail store to the customer. And transport is from between facilities that produce products and sell products from the cultivator to the retail store. And so they're literally picking up products and delivering it to where it's going directly to housing. As opposed to the other ones where there's a significant amount of product that's going to be housed handled inside of the facility. So some special considerations need to be taken into account when we're talking about the product actually being on site.
So just to make sure I understand it, an establishment that is a transport business or delivery business would probably include like an office or garage and vehicles, but none of the product is stored on site. It's just the space from which the delivery vehicles and dispatcher of those vehicles and bookkeeper for the business are actually doing the business.
That's right.
Next question is about some of the family districts where this would not be allowed. And you mentioned in the input plans that go downtown, the district. Well, more plans that we as a board voted on, we talked about a lot of commission. But how about PDDs and PDUs? Do those, what is their status on this?
To my knowledge, the underlying zoning would apply. But I don't know if that came up in discussions prior to that. So I would refer to anyone who might know that we were considered.
So that's probably a policy question that we would ponder and think about because there are quite a few of them that are large and PDUs, for example, there's quite a process to look at uses and bulk and setback standards and things and use of content. And you decide what suite of uses and how to change them is more appropriate. And they're kind of individual in nature. And so it seems to me that this consideration would also not be a perfect fit in each one of those PDs, even if done on its own, probably just survive. Seems to be one more work. So I think we would want to think about that from a policy perspective, but my suggestion at the moment is to include them in that list of areas where additional study would be required. Okay. My next one is about the additional standards for the special permit. I'm familiar with the the existing standards around historical values, architectural compatibility, health and safety, nuisances, mindfulness, and all that. When you do a special permit, city planning commission, it's a great way to see that. So those are familiar with. But this ordinance creates new ones. And I'm kind of struggling to understand what they meant to be, and how a commission can actually apply it, particularly without a track record elsewhere. In the state. So right now, there are 3 additional criteria, and one of them has additional parts. So the first one is, well, the first one is all the criteria that got in special permit law. The next one is that health and safety and welfare of the public in general, and the neighborhood in particular. Let's pause on that for a moment. Because that seems to be quite a number of costs, because everyone, the quite a few people who are hearing about this for the first time, and they show up to the public hearing saying that these businesses are engaged with the public, the health of the general welfare of the public, based on what they think about these establishments, even though we've not had them before. So how is that written in a way that's helpful for a commissioner?
And Director Lawyer pondering,
Do you have more school boards we need to explain?
Yeah, thank you. Is this working? It is. I think the intention, leaving it a little bit to be perhaps not as concrete, was to allow some flexibility around the interpretation, depending on what the concerns are in particular neighborhoods. I understand the challenge that faced by the commissioners in interpreting it, but I think that discussion will be very fruitful when these things come up in yielding what areas need clarification and what are the areas of greatest concern for neighbors. So, I think we should think of this as a work in progress that could be modified as people become more familiar with how this gets implemented.
I hear what you're saying, and certainly would not want to cut off discussion on this public concern about those area issues. Like we want to be able to do those issues. But how is the commission? I guess I'm not asking you to answer. I'm just pointing out.
Yes.
That it's very generally wrong, and so that would end up, I think, giving commissioners wide discretion to interpret how they are best able to interpret, given the evidence presented, which is mostly the opinion of people, and not extensive track record of these establishments in the state or community. And so I think that's going to be that's kind of tricky.
May I add one more point?
Please.
So one thing that we can do, and I know that EJ and his team has been trying to, is starting to look more closely at what is happening in other communities and some of the literature and research on this. So in addition to public opinion, that's one thing that I would see being part of the discussion as well as this moves forward, better understanding, as communities get more experience with these types of establishments, and we start learning about the real implications, what is happening. And I'm not talking about hearsay, but really, case studies and research. So that is one thing we should certainly bring to the table as staff to help inform those discussions.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. And I would note that according to the summary of the commission added a suggestion to its report recommending that the board of Alder's conduct its own study of the impact of these or the experience of the municipalities that allow us to tell you that will not take because the bar to understand some of these issues so that but that they're urging caution. So that's in there. So the other additional criteria that I want to talk about is the following suitability criteria: proximity to sensitive sectors, which you mentioned before, in proximity to schools, gardens, places where children can travel. the location, size, and nature of the intensity. But I think maybe, yes, I'm talking about a huge warehouse across the market. Potentially using more and more time. Provisions for order control. There's this knowledge here, there's 30 minutes of action. Obviously, we're going to want commissions that want to make sure that the developer, the operator, that can really take time around ventilation, order control, and security. The last one, to me, a little bit flummoxing for me. Maybe there's something you had to do about. Provisions to foster and encourage subsequent adaptive use of the structure proposed to use as a cannabis establishment. Does that mean like we wouldn't want to approve an application that has a physical setup that is so unique and particular that it could never be renovated into some other structure? And how would that even be possible?
I don't know how it would be possible, I guess it would be possible, but this would address that.
I'm just thinking about it from the perspective of the commissioner, so lots of years. And, you know, commissioners see things about how they interpret things, and that one would need a little more, you know, flesh on the bone. So I think I may be done for now, Mr. Chair, and I've got to
Yeah, you may actually be.
Michael Pentos, Corporation Council, just to believe in your the sort of thought process on it. The initial grasp of the chemicals that actually a very extensive section on adaptive reuse. And I think it's in conversation with W. Very Long and former director Jim Woods. I think these are designed to make long-term thought process through, so we don't have this sort of climate change issues and reducing, effectively reducing the compression for sort of not building buildings that are hot. There were hopefully looking for buildings that are more intentionally designed so that they can be adaptive. And as you said, not sort of the same purpose structures that have been torn down when that use is no viable or moves or whatever, and sort of stuff that really is difficult to not that I agree with those. We actually put a lot of that out to sort of streamline it with a much more broad and flexible. And but you have to require a little tweaking to clarify that we want to be responsible. It's more nudging. We've got to be in a sort of nudge in the right direction as opposed to making it responsible. You have to meet this criteria.
Okay, I'm just thinking about it, how it might actually play out. So part of me thinks like, oh, the city wants to make sure that these buildings don't become so drenched in marijuana stage that it can never be reused for anything else and they would have to be torn down. So that's one thing I think about. The other thing I think about is, well, is there something peculiar about some of these uses that means that a certain kind of structure that has to be dealt with, not usable by any for any other purpose. And I don't know anything about the industry, so I'm true. Because those are some of the things that I think why we put it in there. Otherwise, I'm wondering if someone who's a representative of the industry would say, well, why is our industry held to this particular standard of construction method when others are not? Because if you're making a case about climate change and durable landscapes and holding people to a higher standard, why would you just do it for this industry when they're not going to be? There's other industries that have much bigger property portfolios in the city, I imagine, in this industry will. So isn't that an issue that should be brought up either in the building code or in the more general treatment of the zoning ordinance towards building methods, as opposed to, well, we're just going to make, you know, if you're involved in this industry, you're going to have to be extra green compared to everybody else.
There was again, most of it came out, and more of it was a question of like how you sort of create open space. Like the earlier drafts definitely had a much more, there was a lot more specificity on building, you know, construction style that allowed for adaptive reuse of interiors. It wasn't so much focused on like, oh, there's going to be, you know, like that, as you said, the stink of marijuana, you know, indelibly in the walls or whatever. It was more a question of like, if you're tearing out interior walls, like can they be relatively easily reconfigured for some other use if you decide not to use that. And I think the idea was it wasn't so much picking on the marijuana industry as opposed to this is like the sort of first step in a broader but it was the industry that was, or the use that was in front of us, and the idea of trying to get this stuff, start to put these things in, build these things in now, as a sort of a first step. Again, that's why when we went through and we pulled a lot of that out, because it did seem overly prescriptive, and particularly some of it seemed more appropriate for the building code. Although that's another issue, because we don't control the building code. That's, you know, we adopted the state building code, or, you know, and we're in fact required to adopt the state building code. So we have a lot less flexibility there. But that's why it was. But to make it less prescriptive and less, and just to make it a nudge in a policy direction, that's why it's relatively broad and relatively flexible.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Alder. I have Alder Furlow next. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll talk loud. Kind of a germaphobe, and I don't want to touch the mics. So I'll be concise. The buffer, well, through you, Mr. Chair, if we can get a copy before all this is over of this map so that we can blow it up and actually see, I think that would help us in our deliberations. Thank you. And the buffer that you have around the schools, are you following the same ordinance or zoning as with liquor stores? Yeah, 500 and then 1,500. What's the,
It's
what's your thought?
comparable. I think it's comparable to liquor stores, and that's what advised the thinking around. Well, the 500 is actually related to the state statute, but the 1,500 is comparable with liquor stores. Yeah.
Okay. Secondly, I see cemetery zone. Most cemeteries are in a residential zone, aren't they? Do we have any cemeteries in New Haven that are outside of residential? So that's something that we can maybe, I'm just curious why that's put in there. And then third, now this is our first round, and so of discussion. So we don't necessarily have to take a lot of time, just asking some questions, and then we can, you know, think about things as we're going along. And then my last question would be on the what is a cannabis event?
Yeah, did you want to address this?
I'm game to listen if it's quick. Yeah.
I was going to address the cemetery issue.
Okay.
Cemeteries are actually separate zones. They're
Well, they're kind of zoned, and then there's like another zone around it. So if you look at Jewel Street,
right,
that cemetery, that's actually in an RM zone. But that little piece of where the cemetery is the cemetery zone, but that's just that little square, right? So there's this big other zone that's around it. And
right,
so, and which would be an RM.
Right.
So
but-
do we have any other
but we could-
cemeteries?
Yeah, if you, like well, I'm not aware of any cemeteries that are not that are not primarily coexist, coterminous, or cemetery zones that are not coterminous with the actual cemetery itself. The cemetery, but you do have, there is is it St. Mary, not St. Mary's, the one over on the boulevard that is adjacent to the boulevard. It was just to make sure that in framing it that way, it's just to make sure that we covered all of the zones of the city. It was sort of belts and suspenders.
And I guess my question is the rationale of a cemetery outside of it being very close to, in some cases, an RN zone. So we can talk about that after. My final question, Mr. Chair, I did have one other one, if I may. Very quickly is, why is Long Wharf excluded? What is the thought process?
So,
That seems to be a perfect place on the highway, off the highway, by Sports Haven. I don't understand the rationale.
so many of these discussions occurred before I came, but I understand there's been, and as Alder Marchant mentioned, quite a bit of discussion and deliberation about what should be included in these MDPs, what the vision is, what the goals are, what types of uses are appropriate. And in order to respect that work and the goals that had been set forth for these special districts, it was determined that it would be best at this time to restrict use, and that it would not be consistent with the goals that were established in those MDPs, in particular Long Wharf. So that could certainly be revisited, but that was the conclusion of the committee.
There's going to be some pushback on that for sure. There's a lot of holders that are wondering what's going on with that. But that's all I have for now, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
As you say, and Alder, to that point, when those MDPs were designed, obviously, when those MDPs were designed or thought through, obviously cannabis was not an option as a use for them at the time. So rather than sort of impose them ex post facto, the idea was to exclude them for now, and then it can be revisited in a more thoughtful way.
Yep, I do understand that, and I do understand the cemetery thing also, but this is why we're here. So we're here to consider all the options, and then because we're starting from ground zero, and to work our way up. I don't like creating ordinances in which we have to reconsider something later. Let's see if we can get it right the first time. It's close to being right. And that's my final statement, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Thank you.
Further questions from the members of the committee?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was wondering if there has been any work done to estimate whether or how many establishments based on the districts that have been outlined in this map and 1,500-foot buffer between businesses, how many establishments could be located in any particular of these zones or citywide. I know specifically a couple of months ago, there was a liquor store that was proposed in my district that was not allowed because of the 1,500-foot buffer. And I'm wondering if we think that downtown specifically, and actually all of these zones are pretty small. So it looks like to me, it's possible that we could only have, it could be one in each zone or something like that. I was wondering if we've looked at how many there might be allowed in each zone.
We haven't done those calculations. I think another limiting factor would be the number of licenses available, and a whole host of factors related to business feasibility. So, how many licenses there are?
Yeah, like you said, we have not looked into how many would end up in each of those very small zones, based on that 1,500-foot buffer. And again, the licenses, even in New Haven in general, we're capped at 5 licenses for retail in general and 5 micro cultivator licenses in general. The number of licenses we'll get from any of those other categories are gonna be determined on an ongoing basis by the state. Because like we're talking about here, we're kind of figuring this out for the first time. I think a lot of the states being just as weird, like we're not gonna cap all the license types at this time. We kind of just have to see where things land with different zoning ordinances and what municipalities' experiences are gonna be.
So just to clarify, our long-term is capped at 5 in the city, and currently there are 12 allowed statewide.
For this first lottery.
First one, yes. Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alder Sega. Alder Morrison.
So, and I apologize for being late. So in your presentation, did you talk about, as far as the taxes, like in regards to other comparable cities, how much tax revenue the city would, could possibly incur from, you know, the whole cannabis coming to the area, because that's really a big piece too, right? Along with the health components and all that. Did you guys talk about that already? So if you guys can just talk a little bit, I know Captain May, you guys have been inundated with cannabis, well, not literally, but inundated with this whole conversation. So if you can just speak a little bit to the financial benefit that this particular item could bring to the city, that would be helpful for me. Thank you.
Yeah, I apologize that we didn't include it in the presentation. What I will say, what I can say now is that there is a 3% additional tax that's put on, I believe, the sales tax here on top of the state taxes, an additional 3%. We have not, I do believe someone did do the calculations, kind of do an estimate, but this is the background that hasn't been officiated yet, so we haven't shared it at this time, but we can prepare that for the next time we have this conversation, have a more thorough calculation of what we can expect. It'll also depend on how many licenses we get, so it's a little bit more complicated, so we will prepare that.
But it would be helpful in your research, just generally speaking, what have different municipalities, how have they financially benefited? Because I think that's something that, you know, as a municipality, as legislators, we're constantly looking at our taxes, our tax rolls, and if this is something that can help with keeping the taxes at bay or even taking a big chunk from away from the residents, that's very helpful. So through this process, I think you all need to know that, keep that in mind. And if you can, let's say through the research, how much different municipalities have incurred, that I think that would be good for us to know.
You're asking for that through the chair.
I'm just asking.
You're asking for information to come back to this committee?
No, I'm asking them to talk now.
So through some of our research for visiting different facilities in other areas of the state, about $3 million can come back to the community. And we could select how to use that money.
And you said you can do what to use that money?
You can decide how you can determine how to use that money.
Okay.
That'll be flexible. But in one city, Springfield, so we get about $3 million.
Right, and you said that money, because I know DG said that there's an additional 3% tax added to the already taxes that we have. And so that 3%, that money is something that can just be determined at the okay. Okay, and I know that Mr. Pinto also wanted to apply.
Just to clarify, there are some restrictions on the use of that tax revenue. It cannot be simply added to the general fund. There are some categories. While we go to the next question, let me pull them up because it is restricted to several categories, and it's a fairly it's a fairly small number of categories for which that tax revenue can actually.
I don't know if that was fully answered, because when now you're saying it's restricted, so it's restricted based on what the city identifies or what the state identifies?
There are about 4 or 5 categories of use. So the 3% tax would stay in the city. However, there's about 3 or 4 or 5 categories of uses to which the tax revenue, that 3% tax, you know, if it's, let's just say, let's make the assumption that it's $3 million. That $3 million can't be just put as part of the general fund. It has to be used, or it has to be restricted for the categories that are established by the state. I mean, obviously, if you have $3 million that are now being used for those categories, it alleviates the tax burden. I mean, it allows you to reallocate other tax dollars.
That's what
We want to make this add moving the intention in the statute, and that was put forward was so that you don't have this whole thing of social equity and just reinvestment. And so I think the intent was to make sure that those dollars were narrowly reallocated back into these initiatives, projects, things like that were most relevant to I guess, better care, if that makes sense. So I think that was.
Yeah, and Attorney Williams did identify, pull up the section. So the tax revenue, and it, I mean, they're broader than I recall. But there are 6 broad, or 6 categories. They can be used, this tax revenue would stay in the city and then can be used to make improvements to the streetscape and other neighborhood developments in and around the community in which a cannabis retailer, hybrid retailer, or micro cultivator is located. Fund education programs or youth employment and training programs and such fund services for individuals released from corrections, probation or parole, fund mental health or addiction services, fund youth services bureaus established pursuant to this section 10-19, and fund efforts to promote civic engagement in communities in the community. So I mean, it is a little bit broader than I thought, but it's not. You can't pay the police overtime with it, without it. You know, so that type of thing. But obviously, those if say we had $3 million in additional revenue, it means that you can reallocate the other general fund money to cover the police overtime.
That was helpful, because when you got real specific, that's why I'm glad that you're able to read it out, because all those different things surround the different things as a board that we hold true and dear to our hearts. And so, okay, I'm done, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Alder.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to clarify, when you say that the tax revenue stays in the city, does that mean that New Haven receives 3% of any cannabis sales that happen at retailers based in the city? The money doesn't go back up to the state and then get distributed to municipalities?
I will actually we'll check with that. I'm not sure whether the retailers would remit directly to the city or whether to the state, and the state then remits it to the city to municipalities. I'm not sure how DRS is setting that up.
Thank you. I guess the purpose of the question is, if New Haven, if we did not have any cannabis retailers at all, would we be expecting to get revenue from cannabis sales statewide, or would we only receive any revenue from cannabis sales if they occurred in New Haven?
Again, we'll check, but I believe you get it from in effect, it's the incentive to zone for and permit cannabis sales in your municipality.
That's what I thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Alder. I think we have a couple follow-up questions. Alder Furlow, follow up.
Just very quick. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just still trying to figure out the placement. And so we have the 1,500-foot buffer that is being recommended. This is a buffer from each other. Is it also a buffer from liquor stores? So they can be next to a liquor store, but they have to be 1,500 feet from each other.
Correct.
But you're following the same sort of pattern of buffer from as liquor stores. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Alderman Rattale.
I think,
Writing up here.
yes, I'm scribbling notes. I appreciated the questions that Alderman Furlow just asked. I hadn't thought about that. And also, the map may solve it for us, but also we should be thinking about is the proximity of these establishments to hospitals and treatment centers as well. But that may be solved by the zones in terms of where those institutions are located. But it's worth, it again points out the need for a larger formatted map so we can actually more closely use that possibility. Which I think you've already agreed to give us through the chair. Thank you very much. My question, there's really just two that I want to ask, and they may end up being just requests. As I read the proposed ordinance amendment, a lot of the definitions refer to the definitions as provided in state law. I would like to see those definitions. You know, this is not my day job, so I don't have the time to read the entire statute. But if there's a key portion, like a definition or key language that refers to the state law, could we see what that state law is?
We will be happy to provide it.
I make that request.
Yes,
Right here.
500 pages.
Right, so
But, yeah.
it is work that we'll have to review because
Yes.
And
it's
the
enough for
reason,
me to read the budget.
right,
Yeah,
the
we-
reason, I'm sorry, the reason those were defined the way, that way, because this is all state dependent, we did not want to define the, write it out because that would mean any amendment at the state level would require an amendment to the.
And that makes total sense that that's what it is.
Yep.
But for our information, we need to know what those definitions are. So that's my first request through the chair. Thank you so much. My second one is about the recommendation from my colleagues in the city planning staff, city planning commission, which was that they thought that special permit should have an expiration date that would sync up with the expiration dates for the state licenses. Could you say more about the discussion they had and comment on, to the extent that you're knowledgeable about those licenses, how would that be practical? And do those licenses have various durations? How complicated is that?
So I know our corp counsel would like to comment on this as well, but currently special permits do not have a duration. There is a case that's pending in the Supreme Court right now that deals specifically with this. And it wouldn't be advisable, most likely, to put special permit limitations at this point on those pending the outcome of that legislation. So I can defer to my colleagues to speak more on that if they wish.
If I just might interject, but there are certain zoning approvals that have to be renewed.
That's
For
correct.
example, there's a special meeting commission that's trying to schedule exactly that question. So
Yes, yes.
Hi, Roderick Williams, 20 Lancelot Drive, North Haven. So you're absolutely correct. Solid waste is one example where there is a 5-year limitation on special permit. I think that this discussion included my advising the commission that there is this pending Supreme Court case, which will possibly guide us and teach us more about the permissibility of this and whether it's something that's subject to challenge. We won't know, but I think that it's always going to be possible that someone would challenge that. There's no real way to know whether they will or they won't. So I think we just have to think about it in terms of what it imposes upon people that have a license, and whether it to the extent that this is the purpose of such an expiration is to allow the commission to see how it does in the neighborhood. It seems possibly contrary to the sort of certainty you want in zoning, to know you're making the decision of a proposed use. So for instance, liquor stores, you don't have to do that. if it's not working out in the neighborhood. So I think to the extent that this is intended to be similar or equivalent, then that's a consideration.
And the other piece of having it be by special permit means that then a subsequent owner or user, I mean, like in effect that use becomes, personal to the initial user. And it doesn't, I mean, to the extent that it's there as long as, John's pot shop, is in business, but if they want to sell it or they, it's not going to be a newspaper. I mean, if they go out of business, like, Joe just can't come in and set it up. He has to go through the same process again. And if circumstances have changed, it allows the commission to then review and look at the circumstances that been on the ground, but also provides sufficient certainty to the applicant at the time, who's invested their money and their time. And frankly, since we don't quite have a sense of how these things are going to be, or whether they're going to be more like Apple stores, like the one in Springfield, big, versus like corner bodegas selling, so it doesn't seem like it's going to be that type of, these are going to be that type of operation. It'll be sort of bigger scale, very slick. There's a lot of money involved in these things. So.
One other thing that Attorney Pinto made me think of is part of the controversy in the case that's pending before the Supreme Court is the notion or the question of whether special permits should run with the land like a variance. So once you get the permission, you have the permission. And the fact that these licenses are specific to people, it's not a natural expiration, but there can't be a turnover from one person to another, that the subsequent operator would need to have a license, essentially. So doesn't mean that someone couldn't hand it off to someone and still be a shadow owner, but it's not the same as okaying a particular use for an open-ended period.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question with your indulgence, Mr. Chair, that may ask more than our attorneys here know, but one of the concerns that comes up before the commission all the time, even though sometimes we understand, is about the track record of property management companies, and they have a reputation of doing a lousy job managing their properties. So why would we want to allow them to develop this one over here, take care of these properties? And so the issue of, are these entities doing a good job of their business, is part of the question sometimes that we discuss in the commission. And when you're dealing with liquor stores, if somebody's running a business that's causing trouble in the community, there's a process to go to the liquor commission and have their license revoked or suspended or whatever. And we've seen that happen recently in our own town, our own city. To the extent that you understand this new statute, is there a similar process for these kinds of establishments where there's recourse to go to the state to say, we would like the state agency that issues these licenses to revoke this license because this particular act or this owner, this operator is a bad actor in the community and is not following the rules that were set forth?
A very good question. I don't know the answer to that specific question. It's a fairly long statute, but I can say that the licenses are subject to renewal every so often, 3 years, 5 years. I think that there might be some inquiry at the time, but we can look at that further.
Through the chair, if you could give us some educated opinion about that, that would be helpful as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Member Don. Any other questions, members of the committee? Seeing one, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was hoping to request through you that if we could get an explanation of how the tax revenue is generated and comes back to the city. Good. Thank you.
I think all of you have your homework assignments. And just as a reminder for everyone, we are going to hold this open at the end of the evening. But if there are no more questions from the committee, we will thank you. And I will ask if there are any members of the public who wish to be heard this evening on this item number 1. A second time, are there any members of the public who wish to be heard on item number 1 this evening? And the third time, any members of the public wish to hear an item like this evening? Seeing none, thank you all again, and I expect we might get some public input at a future meeting when we've had time to digest some of what you laid out. Thank you. Moving on to the second item on our agenda, item 2 OR-2022-0002. The ordinance text amendment to the Haven zoning ordinance to require and incentivize inclusion of affordable housing units in market rate development. Oh boy, that sounds familiar. Presenters for item number 2 may come up and join us at the table. And just again, as a reminder, as the new item, please just once more give me a request for the record. Before you begin, but you may proceed when you're ready.
Good evening once again, Michael Pinto, Assistant Corporation Counsel, 449 Central Avenue. What you have before you, you have already, this committee and all this general, and the full board has already passed the inclusionary zoning ordinance. And in the process, as part of that ordinance, it directed the city plan commission to implement regulations in a document called the ISO manual or something. Was a big long. Anyway, as part of that, the manual talked about rental limits on rents and there was also raised some questions as to inconsistencies between the IZ text and the general, which had a different definition of affordable housing than the general zoning ordinance. As part of that, the City Plan Commission asked recommended that we go ahead and try to implement some prepare and implement some amendments to the IZ text to make express and explicit what we believe was already implicit in the authority to limit rents as part of the IZ ordinance and IZ manual, and also to clarify the definition so that we would reduce the conflict between the section 1 of the zoning ordinance, which has a general definition of affordable housing, and the inclusionary zoning, which is a more restrictive definition. So, without further ado, as I was going through somewhere, I realized that as part of the amendment, it actually was seeking to amend the affordable housing, the general definition of affordable housing. I certainly recommend that I will reinsert the original definition in this section with substitute. I will submit substitute language. So if you look at
Take me there.
first page of the text of the substitute section 1 definitions. There is a word. This is not the definition that is checked. If you look in Unicode, I will, and effectively, this has already been adopted by the last passage of IZ. I think it's incorrect. We should be reinserting what is currently in Unicode using that generalized definition. And then, so that would be the only change. This would be reverting, making sure that we pass an amendment that includes a reversion back to the original definition, original general definition of affordable housing for this. Then, when we get to section 50, section 50B, these are the specific changes to address the concerns of the commission and as we discussed with the others. Creating a new definition, which is the IZ affordable unit. The IZ affordable unit definition has three elements. That these are dwelling units, which is a required or a voluntary set aside, which we under section 52, see that the unit is restricted to families at 50% of the area median income, and for which the rent is capped at those combination of rent and utilities does not exceed 30% of that household's income. And then when we get, so by using that definition, it allowed us to make the changes in when we get to section 50C, where we talk about the inclusionary housing set aside. And so you have to now set aside in the core market 10% of the dwelling units as IZ affordable units. But that set aside now specifically limits who can apply and how much they're allowed to charge for rent. It sets the formula. Again, it's not a specific cap on each unit would be, but it caps what you can charge for a given household. Again, that household has to, when they apply, can't have a income greater than 50% of the area median income. And whatever the rent is that you're charging for that can't exceed 30% of that household's and so then we inserted this definition of IZ affordable units throughout to make this consistent in all of the housing set aside 50 CU section. Subsection 3, all of that. All of those there's four categories: full market, strong market, citywide inclusionary set aside, and then for those who the voluntary set aside. There was one other area, and so then on the next page we get to specific directions to the city planning department to review applications, to verify compliance, that when the development is under review, that the income and rental limits mean that those set aside units actually qualify as the definition of an IZ affordable unit. And subsequently, the director of LCI is directed to review the leasing plans and rent rolls to verify the ongoing compliance with the IZ affordable unit requirements. And that also that there's the deed restriction, ensuring that the IZ set aside units are in place for years. One other important piece was there was questions about the right of appeal. Again, making express and explicit what we believe was implicit, and also trying to work. One of the goals in using the way the manual was developed was to try to piggyback as much and use parallel structure as much as we could. So we want to create a new structure for the to. So there are three areas of appeal: an appeal of administrative order, city staff. As is already the case, this simply makes express and explicit that they can appeal. The zoning order of the zoning enforcement office can be appealed to the Board of Zoning Appeals, which is already established. Land use permitting or site plan are appealable to the Superior Court, which is already shown in the general statutes. And then if there was an order of non-compliance or a complaint violation of the ongoing requirements would be appealable. The violation would be imposed, and the appeals would be pursuant to the same process as the complaint. And that is the extent of the changes.
Thank you, Attorney Pinto. So just, I think I know the answer to this question, but just to get it for the public. You know, there's a good amount of red line here, but the proposed text amendment here is not changing the levels of portability that the initial law implemented. It's not changing the geography of the zones. It's not changing, in other words, the substance of what we passed. It's just clarifying and restating the authority and sort of the how it works.
Correct. The goal here was not to change or alter the umbrella of the policy. It was simply to address the concerns of the commission that certain authority wasn't expressly stated, particularly the delegated authority to the LCI director and the city plan commission. This document now makes it, makes clear, well, reduces those conflicts between the definitions, the general definition of affordable housing, and then makes expressly clear so the ability to impose the rent caps and create what that definition of, or what that formula is to arrive at the IZ affordable rent.
Okay, yeah, no, I just wanted to make sure for the public record that's crystal clear. And so I will now open it up to colleagues to make questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the city staff for their work on this. It was quite a eye-opening moment when we had that comment come to us, City Plan Commission, and I'm grateful that the staff acted quickly to address the concern and to offer this clarification. So thank you so much. And at the last commission meeting, there was a moment where the chair of the commission pointed out a couple of instances where affordable units was not made IZ affordable units. And so I think I may have found a couple more.
I've gone through it and I'm going to double check it. I will include that substitute because I was looking at.
Yes.
There were a couple of places where where they're talking more generally about affordable housing. And so there are places where it has not been changed.
Okay.
But I have gone through and I will Laura and I will go through it, and Rob and I will go through it again with a fine tooth comb.
Well, I will just offer for your consideration, section 50 CJ small 3, and also 50D. This is the introduction. It says incentives for the development of affordable housing units. And so, you should consider those to see if those references to affordable units are the broader term of affordable units, or if they're actually the IZ affordable units, just to make sure that we're dotting the I's and crossing the T's on that. So that's my first comment. My second is, I'm wondering if any, so the question that came up in the commission meeting was, hey, this ordinance is great, but it isn't explicit in granting the authority to the city to cap rents for all these IZ units, right? What we're now calling IZ units. I heard that there was also a concern about the section related to set-asides for section 8. And do we feel confident that the language there is tight enough and strong enough to, is there any similar vulnerability about perhaps the ordinance not being explicit enough about authorizing the city to cap rents in the prescribed way? That's my second question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Get the question because I'm not sure.
It's in regards.
I don't recall the comment at the commission, and I apologize.
Yes.
All of our John before you proceed, all of
Alder Rosa Ferraro, Santana, Ward 13.
All of our John, go ahead.
I'm not remembering exactly where I heard this comment, but I heard an email from Richmond or a comment, I don't know, but there was, I heard tell that somebody, it may have been the same person, raising concern about the section of this ordinance that deals with the section 8 component. Does that section also need further clarification to ensure that the city explicitly has the authority to do what this ordinance is supposed to do around rents for section 8? So I would just call that to your attention, rather than ask me to do an analysis on the spot, Attorney Pinto. But, you know, I think it would be good just to kick the tires on that one and report back to us, through the chair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you all for your time. I believe also they
Yes, I do share my colleague Moore's 25 concerns about the language in section 3A.
Okay.
Where it says that, I have two concerns. Related to section 8, I think so the language reads, IZO applicable developments should prioritize an additional 5% total number of dwelling units for purchase or families with housing choice, section 8 vouchers. And I think the concern that was raised at the City Planning Commission meeting or via email was that similarly to the concern about IZ units in general, this language does not specify what level of rents would be allowed for housing choice recipients or holders. So I think the question was whether it would make sense to add language here that said something along the lines of that the total cost of rent and utilities for units prioritized for section 8 voucher holders could not exceed the fair market rent as determined by HUD, which I think is how those section 8 vouchers work.
I
So
was just saying, I think they're capped at 30% of their income. I think you're not allowed to charge that.
Yeah.
Right, but we can, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to add that it's possible that it could just be clarified that those are also IZ affordable units, in which case they would need to meet that definition. Which may not be clear in the language.
I think the IZ affordable units specifies, the definition of IZ affordable unit includes the 50% AMI language, so I think that it would need to be some kind of different language that I think we need to look into. You know, I agree. I think that it's right that HUD prevents anyone using a voucher to pay more than 30% of their income. But I'm not sure if that necessarily would prevent the rent from being higher than the fair market rent that is allowed with section 8 vouchers. I think this is just something that keep through.
Can you repeat the language you were suggesting? Is it?
So my understanding is that with section 8 vouchers, there is a fair market rent determination made by HUD that says how much the federal government would be willing to pay a landlord for a unit. And if we're hoping that section 8 voucher holders would be able to rent these units, we would need to require the landlord to ensure that we would need to require them to be renting at that fair market rent or lower. Otherwise, no one with a section 8 voucher would be able to rent that unit because HUD would not allow them to rent that unit. So the language that I had sort of quickly pulled together was saying that adding that As you applicable developments shall prioritize an additional 5% of the total number of dwelling units for persons or families with housing choice Section 8 vouchers, such that the costs of rent and utilities for such units does not exceed the fair market value for such units calculated by something along those lines. Might make sense. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Alder David. And again, just to clarify, we are not talking about changing the mix of what this committee has already passed, what the board has already approved, but we are just making sure that works. So we thank you for your attention to that. Alder Morrison.
So my question was really a follow-up to the seventh ward. In just clarifying, as far as this language that you're talking about, because as we all know, people, you have a Section 8 voucher, but at the same time, landlords will say, yeah, you can come here with your Section 8 voucher, but you need to pay an extra $300 a month. That happens. And so because we know that's a reality in our communities, is that what you're more so speaking to, Alder, to make sure that we have a language that speaks specifically to that landlords will not be able to supersede, because they can say the rent is $900 on the face value. Your voucher is for $900, but it's really $12, but you really, really want that place. And so there's that whole thing that people feel as though, well, maybe I should go into that type of agreement because I really want this place. And so it sounds like our Alder from the 7th Ward is speaking, is basically saying we need to have clear language that says that cannot happen, especially in one of these type of places, because that type of bargaining, I should say, can happen and does happen all the time. So I just wanted to make sure that I'm hearing you right. And if I am, yeah. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, pardon me. Further questions from colleagues on this item? Alder.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also had another question, which is related to the language around, also in Section 3A, the language around what happens if a unit that is prioritized for Section 8 voucher holder is not able to be placed and proper documentation is approved by the city. A unit with housing choice priority may be rented at no more than 80% of AMI until vacancies occur. And it seems to me like we might want to alter that language where it says maybe rented at no more than 80% of AMI to reflect the language in the IZ affordable unit definition that explains the sort of rent cap that we're hoping to implement here, where it would say something along the lines of that these units may be rented to households that have a combined total annual income for all members that does not exceed 80% of the New Haven area median income as defined by that. Just so that language would be the same. I don't know.
Tracking.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
Thank you, Alder. I think that's all as well. Further questions? Seeing no more questions from the committee, we thank you both again. And I will ask if there are any members of the public who wish to be heard on item 2.
We will submit substitute text and put all suggestions and just to make sure we're all clear.
Great. That was my sister. I was trying to do everything on the fly. You will, of course. should we move this maybe a little bit forward? But I will ask again, second.
Thank you, Chair. I was wondering if you could clarify what you meant earlier by that we were reverting the language about affordable housing back to the previous definition.
Okay. I didn't catch it in the so if you go to the community code currently, there is a definition in section 1 of the general part of the zoning ordinance, which defines affordable housing, the term affordable housing, affordable rental housing, or housing affordable to rental households is housing that costs no more than 30% of the income for rent utilities for households earning 60% of less income. And it goes on. If you look at section, and I didn't catch this as we scratch it, and we initially passed this, recognizing that there is now is if you in the first page, Article 1, Section 1 effectively purports to amend Article 1 and replace that definition of affordable housing with a new definition, which I was never comfortable with, because for occupancy by household, but that's a combined total income for all homes that does not exceed the designated area median income, which basically says no. And the broad classification should not be confused with these specifics. We want to be specific. We don't want to. It seems unnecessarily vague, and it doesn't appear to be intentionally flexible. It just appears to be vague. And using and simply, so in the substitute text, we will reinsert this, what was the existing language for affordable housing, so that the amendment, when it passes, readopts that language. Because currently, when we pass this in February, we adopted this new language that isn't February.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you all. Any members of the public wish to be heard on item 2? Any members of the public wish to be heard on item 2? Seeing none, that is my third call. Thank you again. Of course.
I just want to say thank you all for your thoughtful deliberations on these items. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you. And we will now move to remind folks is administrator of the New Haven Democracy Fund submitted the 2021 annual report for the New Haven Democracy Fund as approved by the board.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Allison Kramer. My address is 107 Carlton Street. Check that I'm using this correctly.
You shouldn't press the button. I remember this from.
Don't
make it up your voice. Don't push any button. Just hold it.
Don't push the button, guys.
I don't know why the button's there.
Perfect. All right. My name is Allison Kramer. I have been the administrator of the New Haven Democracy Fund since 2014. I'm here to present the annual report. Major components of this are that we just had a election for mayor in the city in 2021, governed by our ordinance. We are able to provide a public campaign financing program to assist with the fair and free election of our mayor and to enable folks to participate in that conversation and run for political office in the city, with the explicit intent of trying to remove money as a major barrier to entry and to make sure that the conversations when it comes to electing our mayor are about substantive content and not just about raising funds. So with that in mind, in the last year, we got a infusion from the general fund of $250,000. We spent $181,000 split between the Democratic primary and the general election. That turned out to be 2 different grants that went out, one for each of 2 participants in the primary campaign and 2 for one for each participant in the general election. This was the first time that we ever had a Republican participate in the New Haven Democracy Fund, which was very exciting for everyone. And we also are responsible for running the mayoral debate. And we, for the very first time, had to limit the attendance for that event to make sure that we could comply with COVID regulations. But we did have over 4,000 views through both the television viewing audience and also the streaming audience through our media partners, Haven Independent, Register, WTNH channels. So in addition to that, there are a couple other big things that I want to discuss. The last time that our ordinance was written and really gone over in detail was 2009. There have been, over the course of 10 years of operation, almost 10 years of operation, with very competitive races. Ever since 2013, we've really started to ramp up use of the fund in these campaigns. A number of issues have come up that we'd like to address with ordinance language change. So heads up that the board itself has been working on that draft language. We hope to present it to this body in the future. And that also involves a couple of changes that happened just at our lower level board rules and bylaws, and also our regulations that the board itself manages themselves. It doesn't require a board of vote. But we try to address informed issues, we try to address participation issues. So if you accept any money now from the Democracy Fund over the course of the campaign, whether it's the primary or the general, you must participate in public forums for as long as you are in that race. So even if you won the primary, but then don't accept public money in the general election, we still make it so that you have to publicly your opponent and talk to the public and answer questions from the electorate. So that was one of the major changes that we made. Yeah, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys might have.
Thank you for that presentation. Any questions for Administrator Heiner from members of this committee? Any questions? Alderman Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Hyman. Are you able to preview any of the potential ordinance changes that you and the board are considering, at least in terms of what the topics are?
Yes, so I did include a very brief tidbit. It is in section 3, that we're talking about the top. So over the course of the last 20 years, there have been a couple of big questions that have come up. The first is, should this program be expanded, because it's proven to be very successful and very popular. It's definitely limited the amount of money that is spent in these races and the amount of time the candidates are spending talking about and raising money as opposed to such a topics, which is the entire purpose of the ordinance. We have also learn a little bit about how campaigns work in a more technologically advanced era. When this was originally written in 2007, Facebook existed, but it wasn't really, social media wasn't really what it is now. And so a lot of the changes that we're sort of talking about address, where we have conversations about politics now, and how those conversations are held, how those things are paid for, and what disclaimers you might need in order to have that conversation, and what disclaimers you should have if you're accepting public money to have those things. The other topics that come up are things like expansion to other areas of political campaigning, not just citywide. We obviously would want you guys to consider and have thought about what it would mean to expand it to town clerk, expand it to registrar of voters, other citywide offices, and even semi-citywide like the Board of Education. We had asked alders back in 2015 and again in 2017 how what the sentiments were about expanding it to the alder races. And at this time, the budgets don't really match up. It doesn't take as much money to run an aldermanic race. It doesn't take, and a lot of that money is already capped at the donation limits by the state, so that this isn't really as necessary. The other concern would, of course, be the tap on the Democracy Fund's actual holdings, and how much that would cost for us to operate, not only in giving out grants to owners, but also in additional manpower needed in order to operate something that was that expansive. But the citywide offices still remain a difficult hurdle. There are fewer and fewer years where it's a contested election, where it's a meaningfully contested election, or where there are candidates who make it through a primary challenge and then into a general election challenge. So if those are conversations that the board, would want to have, we welcome you to have them. And what we want to provide is an outline of an ordinance that allows for that increase over time. So right now, a lot of the language is mayoral campaign. We would linguistically change that to either city campaign or candidate campaign in order to allow at a later point to say these are the following races included in this definition. So that's a really good one. Again, formalizing the participation in public conversation after you take public money is really, really important. And then also over the past 2 decades, the ability to do online reporting through the State Elections Enforcement Commission, SEC, has been expanded to municipalities. It never existed for municipalities before. And so we want to make sure that that remains strong, and that support for online finance reporting actually is very important.
Thank you for that. I very much appreciate it. As I reflect, I can think only of 3 offices that are citywide. 4: the mayor, the town clerk, the registrar of voters, and the judge of probate.
Right.
Those 4, and then the board of education seats are 15 boards each.
Yes.
Other than that, all other municipal offices are alders, 1 board. Gotcha.
Yep. And again, any expansion would have to be something that was found in the ordinance. There would be a lot of questions coming with that, including what it costs to run that kind of grant program, whether or not the grants would be the same as mayor. Traditionally, if you go back and look at the numbers of what these races cost, running for town clerk costs about 1/5 of what it costs, or at least people spend about 1/5 of what they spend instead of running for mayor. So one might think that the grant should be reflected as a lower amount. All of those things would have to come under consideration if we were going to expand. Again, that's not the purpose of the ordinance review. It's just to give you guys the linguistic framework to do that expansion in the future, should that be something the board wants to consider.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Hyman.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your work for this report. We came through quite a season, didn't we, with COVID, and I just want to say that I'm looking forward to the future goals that you have and its realization. And so I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for the work that you're doing through this board, through the Democracy Fund, and it's an important process in our democracy. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Any other questions? Seeing no questions from the committee.
I would like to simply point out that this year is a CPI increase year, which means that we are going to be adjusting the grants based on what the ordinance requires us to do. We do it once every 4 years. And we go based off of the Bureau of Labor Statistics inflation measures. And right now we're looking at about a 15% increase across the board to all costs. So we did make a request for additional funding, and we consider that, you know, mandated by the ordinance, we have to inflate all of the grants, all of the minimum matches, and all of the minimum contributions that we receive by 50% in the next election.
I believe that's my colleague from the department. Thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you guys so much.
Are there any members of the public who wish to be heard on item 3? Any members of the public who wish to be heard on item 3? Any members of the public who wish to be heard on item 3? I see none. I see Alderman Tom.
Mr. Chair, I move that we close the public portion of this meeting.
Is that correct? And it's been seconded. Any discussion?
Well, Mr. Chair,
Yes, Alderman.
I rescind my motion. Well, it's a procedural question. We're going to, I think we are able to rescind, able to close the public portion and subsequently vote to continue the public hearing on one of these items. So that's my intention.
That's my understanding.
I believe we've done that.
Or could we just close the public portion for items 2 and 3?
I think we would have to close the public portion of the meeting, but then would we need to vote on item 1 in some way to continue it, or would we simply not?
Just take no action.
Okay.
It'll stay in committee.
Okay.
Lay it on the table, you.
You don't need the table. Just don't take any action. Just
Okay.
leave it there. And then just bring it back up.
Okay. So. in that
Mr.
case,
Chair, I move that we close the public portion of this meeting.
There's been a motion seconded. Any discussion on the motion? Aye. Any opposed?
Mr. Chair, I move item 2.
Item 2 has been moved and seconded. Discussion on item 2. Alderman Ock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to leave my thanks to the city staff for everybody doing that consent through the city plan process. I want to thank colleagues of the meeting tonight, and I feel very positive about recommending basically these clarifying items to the board.
Thank you, Alderman Ock. Further discussion? All day.
Like my colleague from the 20th board, I agree and thank our city staff for working on this and look forward to seeing additional language to make sure that we that our inclusionary zoning ordinance does exactly what we want to provide affordable housing to folks.
Thank you all for taking. Further discussion on item 2. I will just echo thanks to our city staff for putting together these events very short order. We realized there was an issue. And also my areas to go on all of those forgetting things that you might have catch. So looking forward to seeing the final substitute language hopefully shortly. Any further discussion on items 2? Seeing none, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Item 2 is there or not?
Mr. Chair, I move that we recommend the board reprint file item.
Okay. Motion to reprint file. Second discussion. Seeing no discussion, we'll vote, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Three, will be read, printed, and published. All right.
Mr. Chair, I move we adjourn.
Any discussion on adjournment? Seeing none, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.